Well, welcome to our talk on meaningful differences in the everyday experience of young autistic children. We're excited you've chosen to join us today for this discussion, which is largely going to focus on the disproportionate stimulus control over the verbal behavior of young children with ASD. To start us off, my colleague Alonzo from the University of Texas at San Antonio we'll be talking about referent-based instruction to strengthen the verbal behavior of children with autism. This will be followed by a talk by Janet Enriquez from the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, who is going to be presenting on increasing the verbal behavior of preschool students with autism in South Texas. And then finally, I'll be back to discuss Cochrane's Q test of autistic stimulus control over verbal behavior. So without further ado, I will turn this over to Alonzo.
Reference-based instruction to strengthen the verbal behavior of children with autism. What is reference-based instruction? Well, it's a generative instruction focused on teaching the operant class rather than specific targets, and it's premised upon Skinner's 1957 work, Verbal Behavior, which was a functional analysis of verbal behavior with particular attention to the verbal operants, mans, which is requesting, echoics, which is mimicking, tax, labeling, and interverbals or sequelics, conversing or replying. Reference-based instruction is a natural environment training model for verbal behavior instruction based on the principles of applied behavior analysis. RBI provides a framework for strengthening verbal behavior across the four primary operants that we just mentioned, mans, echoics, tax, and interverbals or sequelics. So this curriculum is based upon Drash and Tudor's 2004 article that was a discussion of autism as a contingency-shaped disorder of verbal behavior. Their presentation, which was really a discussion about interventions rather than any ideology of autism, but their interest was in strengthening the verbal operants in order to weaken stereotypic, restricted behavior and movement, those autoisms. In order to weaken, ameliorate those, the stimulus control would be directed towards others through verbal operant training. So the verbal operants essentially become the bridge between the learner with autism and their parent or their family or caregiver, the community at large. And we use reference as a hub for developing verbal behavior, providing an efficient and effective method of developing an individualized treatment plan that is functional for the child. You recognize that this is Lorna Wing's triad of symptoms, but to reiterate, of the dozens and dozens and dozens of things that we refer to as autism spectrum disorders, all of them have specific communication deficits. You know, for example, 40% of individuals with autism may not have vocal verbal behavior. They don't speak. The money shot for me, the principal difficulty involves social skills deficits or interactional skills deficits or reciprocity. And I've already made reference to the restrictive repetitive behaviors that are associated with autism. So in order to transfer stimulus control from the learner with autism to others, the bridge is again between the learner with autism and other people. The bridge is through verbal operants. RBI is a behavior analytic treatment plan that consists of verbal behavior training and precision teaching. What distinguishes RBI from other applied behavior programs is its focus on the transfer of stimulus control across the verbal operants. There's a lot of research that supports, that indicates that verbal operants facilitate the emergence of verbal operants, and that's really the basic tenet of referent-based instruction. An important concept is Rosales-Reis and Baer's idea of behavioral cusps, and verbal operants represent the most significant behavioral cusps, at least in our perspective. And those cusps are behaviors that have consequences beyond the change itself and exposes the individual's repertoire to new environments, especially new reinforcers and punishers, new contingencies, new responses, new stimulus control, and new communities of maintaining or destructive contingencies. The term referent, ultimately, we adapted it from Skinner, who originally discussed a referent has a verbal behavior that's brought under the narrowing control of the relevant properties of a stimulus. Another relevant concept, you know, in applied behavior analysis, reinforcement is everything. So the significance of the preference assessment, which are those procedures for identifying stimuli like tangibles, items, activities, us, we can be socially reinforcing. But we're identifying stimuli which have potential as reinforcers for the targeted behavior of verbal responses. And so this is RBI. And these sessions were conducted at the Autism Research Center. We had a VB lab in the basement of UTSA's downtown campus, and the technicians were students. They were generally graduate students that were sitting for the BCBA exam, some undergrads. And so essentially we'd bring in 8 students a semester, and we would have 2 students working with the learners with autism. You would have 2 sessions in the afternoon. There were 90-minute sessions, and we had a facilitator with the primary behavior technician. They were making sure that they were taking data. They were making sure that there was a continuous instructional flow. And the RBI was kind of structured as MILU language training, which had within it the identification of a preference. And we identified that, we call those reference, and they served as a focus of control for the verbal operants. They also functioned as the reinforcers. And RBIs involved loose teaching. So that was how we programmed for generalization. And this allowed for the verbal operants to serve as behavioral cusp for related skills, play skills, social skills, group skills, and also to develop stimulus control, listener responding, visual discrimination. The Autism Research Center implemented RBI as a dynamic 9-to-1 ratio of natural environment teaching. So part of it looked like discrete trial training, and within 90-minute sessions that were broken down into 10 minutes, there was 1 minute of a fluency probe. And there was certainly an element of game theory, and the behavior techs made strategic programming decisions based on fluency probes. Yes, so this is Vanessa and Melissa. Vanessa is acting as the facilitator. She's taking data, and she's watching the training, and she, with a grease marker and laminated index cards, she's creating prompts for the 1-minute probe that Melissa is going to go through after 9 minutes of instruction. I very much miss the verbal behavior lab. It was 1,200 square feet. It had slides, it has swings and trampolines and playhouses, and any toy that you can imagine was there. It was a child's dream that children would run in there. A child would run in there, and let's just say, for sake of a discussion, that what they ran to was a ball, and so that ball became the referent. And so the child would be playing with the ball for a little bit, and then you have to be careful not to evoke problem behavior. But let me see that. You would hide the ball, and you would, in order to evoke the man, you would say, "What do you want?" And then again, when the ball is not visible, you can get the echoic, say ball, or the tact. You would show them the ball. What's this? Sequelic or interverbal, you were watching how they were playing, and you could say you roll or you bounce and you use that as a fill-in. And that's how we were evoking the verbal operants from the man. And this is a very intense looking 1-minute probe. Of 71 cases, 22 were eliminated due to pre-test assessment of strong verbal repertoires, missing or incomplete pre-test and post-test, attrition from the program, or inability to acquire informed consent. And so the study that we're reflecting on here, this reviews the outcome of the remaining 49 participants. 86% of them had autism spectrum disorder, 14 related language conditions. They were between the ages of 2 years and 6.5 years. The average age was 3 years, 5 months. There were males and female participants that came from a variety of culturally, socioeconomically, and linguistic diverse backgrounds. And most of the students actually that came to the lab were from San Antonio, and the diversity is really a hallmark of this population. And the participants received 90 minutes of RBI, which again focused on 4 elementary operants, the manzacoics, the texts, or the interverbals, sequelics, 4 days a week for 13 weeks, Monday through Thursday. And we use, for the purpose of evaluating, we develop a metric called the stimulus control ratio equation, which is a metric of disproportionality. So this is a pre-test. Actually, this child appears to have a pretty nice balanced verbal behavior repertoire. And however, the disproportionality, this is when you compare it to the null hypothesis. You see there what is hypothetically absolutely perfectly well-balanced verbal operant repertoire. This is indicative of fluency in verbal behavior. You know that we, in running a verbal operant experimental analysis that Janet's going to talk about, but in running this assessment, we use those proportionalities to create a prompt hierarchy for errorless teaching. And so, and this is with an algorithm that this is created. So each child had a very specific individualized treatment plan. We were able to, we kind of identified verbal operant strengths, emergent, which was minimal verbal behavior, practical, moderate, and strong, which approximates what a neurotypical child's verbal operant repertoire would be like. And you see progress has measured by score, by the stimulus control ratio equation across the groups. So, for the purpose of this discussion, this study, after 13 weeks of intervention, the average score of all the participants across all 4 repertoire sizes increased to the next level. And there you see it. And this is just an example. This is a child that came in. This is what their verbal operants look like as depicted by this, this colored pie graph. Lots of echoics, lots of tacks, some mans, very few sequelics, and 13 weeks later, what do we have? Well, pretty obviously better balanced verbal operant repertoires with increasing, I should say, sequelics or interverbals. Looks good. You know, if you're interested in the verbal behavior stimulus control ratio equation score, perspectives on behavior science, this issue tells you everything, exactly how to do it. You don't have to order anything. It's just in this article. And last fall, it's available online, but Behavior Analysis and Practice really has the results of has the paper that I just reflected on during this presentation. And so I think, I know that Janet is she's going to do the heavy lifting, and she's going to talk about the verbal operant experiment and analysis. And she's also going to talk about when we got out of the basement and took this show on the road across school districts across South Texas, you know, from the basement to classrooms. Hey, Janet.
Thank you, Alonzo. Yes, so I'll be sharing with you all increasing the verbal behavior of preschool students with autism in South Texas. It's important for me to share that this was a collaborative initiative with a number of agencies working together. This was primarily an opportunity that was given by Texas Education Agency, the Texas Autism Grant, spearheaded largely by the UTSA Autism Research Center, as Alonzo mentioned earlier, in collaboration with 9 South Texas school districts, alongside Cook Children's Medical Center and Education Service Center Region 20. So many of you all may be familiar with a variety of different resources that often can help aid language development programs. And some of these are used in public school districts or clinics. We're specifically going to be sharing more about the verbal behavior stimulus control ratio equation and how the score applies across the range of verbal behavior assessments. So the stimulus control ratio equation is a way to precisely measure the complexity and the interdependence of learners or students' verbal repertoires to identify and facilitate very specific treatment goals. Sundberg noted that typically developing individuals have a tendency to develop relatively proportional levels of strength across those 4 basic verbal operants. However, we know that children diagnosed with autism demonstrate highly disproportionate levels of strength. So my colleague suggests that the relative strength among these verbal operants, and the ease to which stimulus control is transferred across the operants is a key measure. So one of the goals of the Texas Education TA Autism Grant was primarily to train professionals to serve a diverse population of students diagnosed with autism. So we aim to promote empirically based strategies for students with autism in classroom settings. We wanted to ensure the meaningful inclusion of opportunities for students with autism, specifically by strengthening those language skills, which Alonzo mentioned earlier as highly important. We wanted to remove those barriers to effective implementation, and this was going to be accomplished through strong parent and staff training components, which were coordinated efforts by all of these stakeholders. So we began with a needs assessment for all of those 9 school districts to address challenging behavior concerns and how we could better implement those intensive teaching strategies across classrooms to promote more meaningful social interactions for students. Program goals really were those that were approved by the Texas Education Agency. We were able to identify 116 students between the ages of 3 and 5 that we were supporting. We trained 131 teachers, paraprofessionals, and speech language pathologists with the help primarily by faculty from the UTSA's Autism Research Center and graduate students that assisted with pre and post assessments of SCORE. And we had some collaboration from our district BCBAs too. So we wanted to train teachers, conduct SCORE assessments, and provide parent training. Implementation consisted of these training components to provide teachers this 2-day training, which covered basics of applied behavior analysis and verbal behavior. They also participated in booster sessions throughout the year to ensure that this was being transferred into the classrooms. Instructional assistants also participated in half-day training opportunities that covered basics of applied behavior analysis and data collection procedures. And our families were offered monthly training sessions that utilize the autism distance education parenting training materials and modules from University of California at Davis. So program implementation consisted of the pre and post assessments using SCORE by our graduate students and BCBAs providing some of those weekly classroom visits that included coaching, modeling, and fidelity checks. We ensured that classroom teachers were promoting these strategies within their daily routines of their classrooms and collecting weekly data. We also had an opportunity to meet with our district BCBAs and had some really nice discussions to ensure that there was some nice data collection going on in those classrooms. It is important for us to share that this was influenced by Lerman et al.'s 2005 study. The purpose here was to develop and evaluate an assessment to identify functions of vocal speech in young children. So again, primarily here, we're looking for the development of a metric to summarize the experimental evaluation of verbal behavior. And this is when we share the verbal operant experimental analysis. So that was influenced. So the VOX exposes participants to 4 assessment conditions: the MAND, echoic, tacit, and interverbal or sequelic in varying order. And each of these conditions lasts about 5 minutes, in which observers use a partial interval recording method to target those responses in 30-second intervals. The 25-minute assessment is repeated 3 times per participant. So we go through the conditions. So we go through the TACT, in which we allow access to a range of stimuli as a free operant preference assessment. At 30-second intervals, we place maybe the hand on an item with whatever the child is playing with and ask them, "What's this?" If the child attacks that item with that target response within those 5 seconds, we provide that generalized reinforcement, and we repeat for the duration of the condition. So as we move on to the MAND, we allow access to that preferred item as part of an MSWO or a paired choice preference assessment. And at those 30-second intervals, we remove access to the item, make sure it's out of sight, they can't see it, they can't hear it, control for potential confounds. And once that item's removed, we ask, "What do you want?" If the child mands for that item within those 5 seconds, we reinforce them with the item. If there's no target response within those 5 seconds, we place the item back on the floor or within arm's length of the child, and we repeat again for the duration of that condition. For the echoic We similarly remove that item from the man condition. At 30-second intervals, we provide the echoic SD, say ball. And if the echoic occurs within those 5 seconds, we provide that generalized reinforcement and we repeat again for the duration of the condition. And lastly, for the sequelic or the interval, remove that item from the man condition. At 30-second intervals, we provide the sequelic SD fill-in. So making note of however the child played with that item, how they interacted with it. You roll the, and if the sequelic or the interval occurs within those 5 seconds, we provide that generalized reinforcement. And we repeat for the duration of that condition. After doing all of those things, right, we are able to see a beautiful graph. I'm sorry, a pie chart like this, right? So we see the VB score. So the VB score quantifies the strength of a verbal repertoire between the values of 0 and 1. So a score of 1 would indicate a very much well-balanced or well-developed or proportional and complex repertoire across those 4 major verbal operants. However, as the score approaches 0, the closer it gets to 0, the repertoire becomes increasingly disproportionate, with each element becoming more functionally independent. So it's important for us to share that the VB score assumes that a perfectly balanced repertoire shows equal strength, right? Balanced strength across those 4 operants, known as the null verbal repertoire, as seen down here. And the extent to which your learner or your student's performance matches that null forms the basis of the equation. So what we see here is a proportion, not a percentage, and the proportion again would be 1. So our overall results are presented here, and our primary goal for the project was a 50% increase, average increase in the verbal behavior score of students with autism as measured with the pre and post assessments. So the average pretest score was for 116 students served through this grant was 0.45, a 50% increase of 0.23, set our benchmark for post assessment at 0.68. So overall, we found that our efforts were successful, though we didn't quite meet or reach that goal of that 50% language improvement. We did have a number of factors that contributed to the results. Primarily, we want to share that we employed individualized language instruction for each of our participants, of our students. The benefit here is really individualized treatment plans that were incredibly prescriptive. These served as instructional guides for our teachers and our families, in which we had students that were receiving a treatment plan based on their present level of functional language at the start of the project. So this was a great treatment plan. So another factor that influenced the results was the wide range of participants that were included in the project. But figure 2 here shows the language gains for students across those 4 groups stratified by their pretest scores. So students that scores fell between 0.00 and 0.19 were identified as having emergent language, and students whose initial assessments ranged between 0.20 and 0.49 were considered to have practical speaking repertoires or be practical speakers. Students whose pretest scores were between 0.50 to 0.79 were considered to have moderate language skills, and anyone who scored above a 0.80 was considered to have a strong speaker repertoire. Parent surveys were made available both in English and Spanish, and we fared pretty well. So when asked to rate their overall experience with the project on a scale of 1 to 5, the average response was 4.42, which was 88%, almost 89% there. So we had a nice response from our families, which indicated that they really enjoyed the project and having their children participate. Here's some comments on that. But there were certainly some challenges and some lessons learned related to teacher buy-in, the lack of prerequisite skills in applied behavior analysis, to include prompt dependency, naturalistic teaching, some classroom, school, and setting constraints, some challenges initially with limited parent involvement and communication, training and staff constraints, as we would think there would be with 9 school district, challenges in regards to time allocation, and certainly the late notification of the award or of funding impacted training, assessment, and the implementation timeline. As far as anyone interested in replicating this, this grant or this project, we do have recommendations that would encourage you all to really be considerate of staff training, parent training needs, collaboration, and those opportunities to work with other professionals, supporting teachers more diligently, and consideration of use of grant funds to make sure that there's novel implementation of professional development. Alonso, do you have anything else to share?
Janet, you did great. And, I'm really, really looking forward to Lee Mason's presentation. So.
Yeah, so am I. I'm looking forward to that. Thank you. And Lee Mason is coming up.
Hello again. This presentation is on Cochrane's Q test of autistic stimulus control over verbal behavior. And I wanted to begin by briefly summarizing some of the advantages of a scientific approach to language. Specifically, we're quantifying the speaking repertoire. We're developing a one-number summary that provides a dependent variable for assessing the effectiveness of interventions, and it allows us to observe change over time. Now, in his book, Verbal Behavior, Skinner states that he sought to provide a more economical way to talk about language. And I wanted to begin with a quote from that text from chapter 8. Skinner says that in the terminology of meaning, we say that the word doll is used at one time to ask for a doll, and at another to describe or refer to a doll. When the response doll has been acquired as a man, however, we do not expect that the child then spontaneously possesses a corresponding tact of similar form. If we find both types of operants in the repertoire of the child, we must account for them separately. This appears to make the task of explaining verbal behavior more difficult, but the advantage which appears to be gained by the traditional concept of the word doll is offset by the problem which remains of explaining how a child may learn to use a word both to express a desire and also to describe an object. The total formulation has not been simplified. Part of the task has merely been postponed. If we are to accept the full responsibility of giving an account of verbal behavior, we must face the fact that the man's doll and the tact doll involve separate functional relations which can be explained only by discovering all relevant variables. However, a verbal response of given form sometimes seems to pass easily from one type of operant to another. The speaker commonly starts with a tact and then appears to possess a corresponding mand. The child in a toy store, unable to identify a particular toy, asks, "What is that?" and is told, "A doodler." This is the stimulus for an echoic response, of the sort which is then commonly used to reinforce the response as a tact. But the child immediately says, "Buy me a doodler." He has never been reinforced for this response in the manner required to construct demands. So the ease with which fluent speakers demonstrates what we call transfer of stimulus control is really a function of these proportionate levels of stimulus control within the verbal repertoire. That is, when we call somebody a fluent speaking, we're tacting this kind of history of reinforcement of transferring control, which typically doesn't come easy if you work with a lot of young children. But by the time we start calling somebody fluent, what we're noting there is that it's essentially how easily they transfer across different verbal operants. We can hear something which provides the echoic source of control and immediately transfer that to be used as a tact or a mand or interverbal response. Again, this is done primarily by noting that this fluent speakers have comparable sources of strength over each of the verbal operants. In contrast, Lovas and colleagues introduced us to the term stimulus over-selectivity, which they describe as a problem with dealing with stimuli in context, a problem of quantity rather than quality of stimulus control. And that is to say that when there are multiple sources of stimulation, particularly those that might come across different exteroceptors, individuals with ASD tend to have what's been referred to as tunnel vision. That is, they only attend to a certain smaller subset of the complete environment. Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior allows us to easily see this. For instance, labeling is largely considered to be a function of the visual repertoire. That we talk about what we see. In contrast, the echoic and interverbal repertoires are largely a function of hearing, auditory stimuli. And on top of that, we have motivating operations to access certain preferred items. And all of this can be very challenging for non-fluent speakers. And essentially, what we're asking today is, to what extent does stimulus over-selectivity affect the verbal behavior of individuals with ASD, for whom communication has been recognized as a core deficit? So we start by modeling the verbal repertoires. At left, we have a model of a fluent speaking repertoire, which we frequently refer to as the null repertoire. That is, for the speaker at left, we will not see any difficulty transferring control across these 4 operant classes, largely, again, because of the balance of stimulus control for each verbal operant. In contrast, at right, we have a speaking repertoire of a child with ASD. You can see that clearly the tact repertoire and the echoic repertoire are larger than the MAND and the interverbal repertoire, which is non-existent. And the question remains is, to what extent are these differences meaningful? Are they impactful to somebody that shows this sort of disproportionate balance? To answer this question, we're going to use Cochrane's Q test, which is a comparison of percentages in matched samples. Cochrane first identified the statistic in 1950, and it's largely been used for the purposes of meta-analysis, determining whether or not effects are seen across different studies. Notably, this is a non-parametric test of matched samples with a binary dependent variable. That is either yes, a study is effective, or no, it's not effective. And applied to our case here, either yes, the child did respond under a certain condition, or no, they did not. It can be thought of as analogous to a one-way repeated measures ANOVA, except that rather than using a normal distribution, we're using the chi-squared distribution. It can be thought of as a Friedman test, except that we're using a binary dependent variable. And it can be thought of as an extension of the McNamara test, except that we're using 3 or more related samples. When there are only 2 dependent samples, essentially the Cochrane's Q test gives you the exact same result as a McNamara test. So here we have some sample data just to show you how such a test would be set up. We have multiple responses noted in the first column here, followed by 4 different conditions upon which we're going to see whether or not each response is emitted. So we have the related samples across multiple conditions. Now, a significant Cochrane's Q test indicates that at least 2 of the conditions represent different populations. And as it relates to the score assessments, Cochrane's Q tells us whether the differences in observed proportions are meaningful. So taking those data, we can develop a stimulus control ratio. Once again, we see that there are certain operants that are stronger than others. In this case, echoic is stronger than tact, which is stronger than MAND, which is stronger than interverbal. And again, our question is, are these differences meaningful? So when we run Cochrane's Q with 3 degrees of freedom, we end up with a p-value of less than 0.05. So yes, it is significant. We also have a chance-corrected effect size R, which tells us exactly how, exactly the magnitude of that effect. And then perhaps most importantly, we're able to run a post hoc Duns test to look and see which of these relationships are in fact significant. And if we look down at the bottom here, we can see that in this particular case, it's only the echoic interverbal relationship that proves to be significant. Nonetheless, we're able to see initially whether or not there's any significance, and then through closer look with the post hoc analysis, which relationships might be affected within a verbal opera, within the verbal repertoire. So we essentially did this for the records from 181 children who received educational interventions related to ASD. Each child received a score assessment and was used to develop an individualized language plan. And then we took those records and ran the Cochrane's Q test as well. These participants were 88% male, 12% female, with a mean age of 3.5 years. They were primarily Hispanic, followed by white, black, and American Indian. They were largely economically disadvantaged as well. and 7% of them were limited English proficient. And it is noteworthy, perhaps, that the score assessment is in fact very culturally responsive, and to date has been conducted in English and Spanish, and we're currently working with the Kickapoo tribe in South Texas to demonstrate that it can be run with Native American languages as well. So for each participant, we recorded 15 target responses across each of 4 conditions: labeling, requesting, copying, and conversing. Before we get to the results, I wanted to note that Tate and Brown in 1970 pointed out that there's some interesting aspects of Cochrane's Q as it relates to determining an effective sample size. So we started with 181 participants, and for each participant, we collected a total of 60 responses. That's 15 different words or phrases across each of these 4 different operant classes. Tate and Brown note that rows of all ones and rows of all zeros do not contribute at all to an effective sample size for conducting Cochrane's Q. So for each individual, when we saw that, yes, they were able to respond with this particular word across each of the categories, essentially we had to scrap those responses from our analysis. They note that the minimum requirements would be a total of 24 responses left for our Cochrane's Q analysis. And this eliminated 71 of our participants, giving us a total of 110 to work with. When we break that down according to the speaking repertoire identified by the score assessments, we can see that for emergent speakers, those with less than a score of 0.2, we started with 51. We excluded 94% of those, which left 3 remaining for our Cochrane's Q analysis. At the practical level, 0.2 to 0.49, we started with 49. We eliminated 15, which gave us 34. For the moderate speakers, we started with 59, and all of those were included in our analysis. And then for strong speakers above 0.8, we started with 22, we eliminated 8, which left us with 14, and that's how we got our total figure of 110 samples to work with. So our results, of those 3 speakers, all 3 proved to have significant speaking repertoires, and the same with our practical speakers. All 34 should demonstrate statistically significant results. At the moderate level, we had 59 speakers, 55 of those were shown to be significant. And then for those strong speakers above a 0.8, we started with 14, but only 3 of those repertoires were significant, putting it a total of 21%. This means that we had a total of 95 of our 110 speakers demonstrating statistically significant repertoires, or 86%. Notably, these were not just marginally significant differences for the most part. More than 2/3 of the time, significance was found at the 0.001 level, demonstrating that we found pretty vast differences in the different verbal operants. When we look at the individual relationships, we can see that the fewest differences were found between the tact and echoic repertoires, meaning that these were largely the same. And the greatest were found at the echoic and interverbal levels, showing the greatest difference between those explicit and derived interverbals. Notably, they were both verbal sources of control, differencing only in the point-to-point correspondence. We found a large negative correlation between score and Cochrane's Q. That is, as score got larger, Cochrane's Q got lower. We also decided to keep in a few of these outliers within our analysis, and nonetheless, our result was still a large correlation between these 2 figures, which makes sense. They largely measure the same phenomenon, just using different calculations. Verbal behavior score accounted for 27% of variation in our Cochrane's Q analysis. But now when we look at this as a Punnett square between those repertoires that were included and excluded, and those that were significant and non-significant, emergent scores were included 6% of the time, but each time they were included, they were significant. Practical scores were included 69% of the time. Again, all of those were significant. Moderate scores similarly were more likely to be included and also more likely to be significant, whereas strong scores were more likely to be included but less likely to be significant. We found a total of 86% of the verbal behavior scores to be statistically significant. But when we eliminate those strong speaking repertoires, this number increases to 96%, which makes sense when you think about it. As our speakers start to develop stronger speaking repertoires, they show balanced proportionality within those 4 operant classes, and therefore they're less likely to be different. So Cochrane's Q-test may be useful in determining the significance of language impairments for individuals with ASD. Notably, the strong correlation with score may supersede follow-up Cochrane's Q analyses, but researchers may find Cochrane's Q more robust due to the p-value and the chance predictive effect size. Most importantly, and consistent with the findings of Lovaas and colleagues from 1971, these meaningful differences across verbal operants may be interpreted as restrictive stimulus control over the speaker's verbal repertoire. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
So it was in spring 2013 that Lee Mason started the Teacher Education Autism Model Center in the basement of the Durango Building, University of Texas at San Antonio's downtown campus. And children were brought in. Ultimately, it would be 8 children per semester. They would be receiving 90-minute verbal behavior training Monday through Thursday, 13 weeks. I'm grateful. I'm totally grateful to him. He asked me to join him the following semester, and my gratitude is boundless. At any rate, that is where reference-based instruction, that's when it was developed. It was, as I've mentioned before, it was a Me-Lu language training. And well, that was the discussion when I talked about reference-based instruction. That's what we wound up calling it. We did need a metrics to track progress, and that became the stimulus control ratio equation score that we've talked about, and that's been discussed. So Janet Enriquez, well, I've known Lee for 17 years, trusted colleague. I've known Janet some 11 years. And the first time I met her, she was a teacher. You know what, she found me arrogant and pedantic, and it's interesting that she's now, her and Lee are they're who I work with, they're my colleagues. You know, I couldn't have better colleagues. Anyway, she's very interested in taking things out of the lab and into the classroom, and out of the lab and into people's homes. She's very interested in teacher training, and she's very interested in parent training, and that seems to be the trajectory of her life. So her discussion was about when we received a grant from Texas Educational Agency to go into classrooms in 9 school districts and run the verbal operant experimental analysis and develop treatment plans that were based on a prompt hierarchy of errorless teaching, and that was described. And so Janet talked to us about how to run that analysis, and she gave us some information about how it worked out, at least in the first year of this grant. So that was that discussion. And Lee has talked to us about a metrics for looking at over-selectivity. And so, you know, however it works out, maybe over-selectivity is not exclusive to autism. That's certainly not a claim, but the fact that over-selectivity, and then specifically in our discussion, how that plays out in respect to language, the verbal behavior, the verbal operants, well, that was the discussion. That was the significance of that. Let me share some resources. Okay, so this is it. I know I just told you that Janet's always wondering, okay, fine, it's in a peer-reviewed journal. How is this going to get disseminated to teachers, to parents? Well, I'll tell you right off the bat that in this first link, this is for the Journal of Visualized Experiments. There's a video that shows you exactly how to do this verbal operant analysis, and then more so, we'll tell you how to calculate score, which again is a metrics of the disproportionality of language. You know that when the point of reference-based instruction is to balance out the repertoire so that you will have a well, you'll have a child that has fluency of verbal behavior, as a neurotypical child may have. So there it is. I mean, watch this video, tell you exactly how to do it. And then more so in respect to this treatment plan, and then maybe more information about SCORE. This second website, this is verbalbehavior.org. I think it's lucky and amazing that we got that. We were able to get that as a website. If you go there, you'll see a sample of the treatment plan generated by SCORE, but even more so, if you do the verbal operant experimental analysis, you do this, you do Vox, and there's a place there's a Google document, you can put your data in there, and you can have for yourself your very own treatment plan that again is a prompt hierarchy for errorless teaching for development of verbal behavior repertoires. It's all there, it's there, have at it. And then lastly, and thinking about Lee's discussion, his discussion of over-selectivity, there's a video, it's real short, it's on YouTube. It's titled Understanding Autism, a Behavior Analytic Perspective. And this is our perspective of how over-selectivity, how it's significant in language, it's significant in terms of sensory experiences. But that's our discussion. It's our perspective on how a behavior analyst would view autism. So, here it is. Here's these websites. I referenced a couple of articles in my presentation. You can read them, they're out there. And I guess what I was hoping is that some of you would be curious enough or intrigued enough to go out there, get a child diagnosed with autism or some related condition, run the analysis, develop the treatment plan, implement the treatment plan, find out for yourself. I mean, again, this is all there. This is free. We want to see people using this. That was the point. And I'm grateful for the opportunity that we had to present these ideas to you all, and have a good rest of the day.